But, you know, again, I think the perspective here that I want to answer the question is really within that Hopkins viewpoint. You know, the ability to sit on the board ends at a certain level of investment just because of conflict of interest rules within the university.
Just follow up a bit on that. What is a typical equity share for a member of a scientific advisory board? Either, you know, through warrants or just through shares. I mean, what would an investor be comfortable with? What would they expect to see?
So I think it varies based on, so the question is what, you know, what's the typical amount, right, and how much? And that's sort of like that's a very popular question, right? And I would expand it not only to scientific advisors, but also to board of directors, to management, you know, what's appropriate. It'll depend on every single case, right? So everything, I can just use my case as an example. We had an advisory board of 5 or 6 people, and there was a range. It was everything from 0.5% vesting over 2 years up to about 2.5% vesting over 2 years. So vesting over time, and, you know, anything from 0.5% up to 2% for scientific advisors. For board of directors, there's a fiduciary obligation. I would argue it's a little bit higher for board of directors, also vesting over probably 2 to 3 years, maybe a little bit longer. And that's probably in the range of anywhere from 1 to even 4%. For management, you know, I've heard numbers for CEOs being the round of 5 to 10%. If you were to bring in an external CEO, could be higher, depends on the stage, depends on the investors. And then for management in general, I think Matt made a really good point, you know, about the option pool and how big that should be. You know, I've heard everything from 10 to 15 to 20% total option pool. So all of that would come from this option pool. So the whole, if you think, you know, in our case, the option pool I think was 18%, so we were a little bit more generous. But that's because we had, again, a lot of people on the advisory board, we had board of directors, we had to spread that.
Can you talk a little bit too, we've been advised that your board of directors seat is a good thing to have for your first investor, your first major investor. Can you talk a little bit about that role of being on the board of directors and preferential stock and actual control of the company? Just talk about maybe like some examples or some of those pieces.
So, governance and control is really, really important. It's something that most first investors will probably want a seat at the board. I'm okay giving up 1 seat as long as I have 2. Let's put it that way. That's like how I would think about it. That's how I counsel the companies that I advise. You know, there's enormous power that comes with, you know, it's not just do you own 51% equity, it's can you actually move items in the board of directors, because the board basically chooses who the manager is, right? So let's, you know, an example would be, you know, if an investor comes in and let's say you're the sole founder, you're the only person on the board. Investor comes in, they put in $5 million, and they take 2 seats on the board. Well, the board of directors typically, and this kind of varies by each company, but they typically select who's going to be the CEO. So the investor could basically swoop in, invest some money, be on the board, and then replace you out of the company completely or to their discretion. You basically have no more control at this point. So, you know, this is also where it comes in, you know, it could be a good thing to have multiple co-founders and sort of have, you know, a founding team that has a vision and sort of a, you know, a camaraderie. But that's sort of one of the, you know, some of the considerations with assigning board, you know, giving board seats to investors. Lots of investors, sorry, last thing is just lots of investors will take passive board seats or be observers or non-voting. So that, I'll do that all day. I mean, like, that's fine. It's the voting members that I have particular, you know, just cost something, right? Either better valuation or more money, or, you know, there has to be some sort of consideration for receiving the board. I wouldn't give it away for nothing.
Yeah. And I would view it in light of Dave's previous comments. It's less an idea of control or this is mine versus if you are bringing on, you know, really reputable board members, the advice, the legitimacy, the validation they give to the company outweighs any perception that, you know, my babies, I'm losing control of my identity.
And just to add to this, I think, you know, the investors, perhaps in your case, they obviously want to see at the table. They want to know what's going on in the inner circle. But even if they're outvoted, I would expect that they would be asking for some control over the company in the form of veto rights. So even though you would have, a majority control over the board, you typically have to, and we certainly negotiate hard when I'm representing the company to keep this to a short list of things that the company may not do without that investor's approval. And so merely having a seat they want to know what's going on so that they can defend those veto rights. That's another reason why they're wanting to be on the board.
The last question I have here is for Matt. How do you best handle friends and family investors?
Okay.
Don't bring them on.
Well, it's funny. I think I often counsel clients not to take that money after they've called me because, especially if they've already started the company, or at least not to tell me about it if they're doing it. And the reason for that is really from a securities law perspective. They are your friends, they are your family, but they're an investor like anybody else. And the federal and all the state securities laws restrict your ability to freely sell shares to people, with certain exceptions. One of the exceptions is you're selling shares in a public company that has its shares registered, and you can go on to the company's website and the SEC website and find all the publicly available information, the company's financials, story about how did the business get to where it is now, what are its plans for the future. Obviously, you're a startup, so you don't have that exemption, or that's not available to you. So the other, so the way you get around that typically is you are raising money from accredited investors. So these are investors, and there's a very clear definition in the Securities Act for the accredited investor. And most of the time, I think it'd be best to focus on a couple of the tests. One would be someone has a net worth of over $1 million, or they have made gross income over the past 2 years of $200,000 or more, or $300,000 filing jointly with their spouse. So these are the high net worth individuals, and if you got friends and family that fall into that category, great. We're off to the races. People that fall below that category, there's a risk that and I think that the securities regulators are focused on making sure that the assumption is that if you aren't a high net worth individual, you don't have the capability to make a smart investment, or that because you have a net worth of $1 million or more, that you're a smart investor. And I don't think there's a strong correlation. But I think it just it says the thought is if you want to waste your money, the rich can throw their money away, but we want to protect those that have less resources. And so I didn't want to get too far into the securities regs, but that's really the reason why I try to counsel clients to the accredited investors. It's easy. There's it really just a form you file with the SEC. No matter who you're selling shares to, you're always subject to the the anti-fraud regulations. You want to be giving all information that is relevant to their investment, but there's no specific type of disclosure you need. If there's friends and family that are being issued shares, you don't have that easy ability to file a form with the SEC or the state regulators. You actually have to go through a process of creating a mini disclosure statement for your investors. So I caution clients against it. I think on the back end they appreciate it because they understand that the accredited investors are typically easier to get to come to the closing table because they have more resources to put into play. All that being said, if you haven't yet formed your company and you are pulling together friends and family money, you can come together as a founding group and form the company together and put someone in perhaps a board position or an officer position. There's an exemption for those types of people in being investors that don't have those high net worth, that don't have the high net worth behind them. So that I don't want to discourage people from using the people that are close to them, but there's definitely talk to your lawyer about the strategies, particularly if you haven't formed a company. There's a pretty easy way to get around the rule.
Okay. Any other questions? Kate?
Would you comment a little bit about the distinction between options and warrants? in incentivizing folks?
Yeah, I think for employees, options are what you would incentivize them with. Warrants are typically issued to, maybe it's a bank that has provided the company financing. So I think they function in the same way. The tax implications are a little bit different for the recipient of the warrant, but it's more of a commercial instrument issued in connection with as I mentioned, a lending relationship or perhaps a partnership with another company. You may issue warrants, but it's exactly the same concept. You would be issuing a warrant, the right to purchase a certain number of shares of the company at a particular strike price or exercise price. And those warrants don't necessarily need to be under the option plan. That can be, those typically are outside of the option plan. So if you're thinking about it, incentivizing advisors, directors, employees, that's going to typically come out of the option plan. The warrants come into play when you're establishing some of these commercial relationships most often.
Legally, can you, if you have a large pool of, say, options, and then along comes J.P. Morgan, pick a small bank, and they want to invest in you, and can you convert some of those option shares in that pool to warrant shares? Or do you have to allocate at the very beginning?
Well, the allocation is really a placeholder.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
So you don't have to issue them. You can contract the plan.
Mm-hmm.
You can't contract it to below the number that have already been issued. But I think in your example, the bank or whoever is the investor that comes in is they're going to decide on a fully diluted basis.
Mm-hmm.
So they're going to assume that all those options have been issued.
Okay.
So that's one reason why you don't want to overinflate your option plan. You want to keep it in that 10 to 15%, as long as you can.
But in the negotiation, you could say, okay, gee, part of your investment is you want some warrants, I'll contract my option plan and...
And they will say, okay, because the dilution effect of the option plan is on your side of the ledger, they would say, great, but we still want to make sure there's an option plan that's big enough to incentivize people going forward, because when you have our money, we want good people, and good people will follow, they'll demand a good option plan. Hopefully that answers your question.
What happens to the equity when someone dies? Is it like bequeathed in their will to whoever they want it to, or how does the company absorb that equity?
It depends on who is the owner of that equity. If it's a founder, things may be different. But let's just take the more rank and file employee that owns an option. Typically, at death, first of all, any options that have not yet vested would be gone and would come back into the company pool. If you have options that have vested, there may be, and these are some of the decisions you have to make in your option plan to decide. Upon death, is there a right of the company to repurchase them? I've seen some more draconian plans that would say if you're deceased and you haven't exercised them, they come back into the company, you forfeit them for no consideration. And we contrast that against what the founders may have, sort of a different deal, because let's assume, and I totally agree with Dave, that in the early years you want to make sure, although you are very comfortable and you're confident in the team that you've picked, you really need to make sure that everybody are committed for some period of time. But let's assume that everybody's vested in their equity. At that point, upon death, people are owning real equity, and so yeah, there are provisions either if it's an LLC, it'd be in the operating agreement, or if in the case of a stockholder, it would be in the stockholder agreement. Or investor rights agreement, where they would be required to, basically the shares do follow however the estate's administered, and that's something the company doesn't control, but what the company does control is what it contracts with its investors in the form of covenants to sell back to the company those shares. So that's a good question, because you don't want necessarily the heirs of one of the founders to be sitting on your board or have the right to place someone on the board. You want to be able to get those shares back and allow the current management team and other living investors to control what's going on.
Last question, Chuck?
With so many startups being formed as LLCs now, how do you handle the concept of founders' equity and vesting in that case?
You know, regardless of the form of entity, the same issues are there, and they're just papered in a different way. In the case of a corporation, it's a stock certificate. You know what you own. In the LLC context, typically there aren't certificates that are issued in the early years. But the vesting can be, in either case, contractually agreed between the company and all the founders. And so I don't really think there's a major difference in the way that's handled. There are some tax considerations to weigh because of, you know, the partnership tax treatment of an LLC. It's great, it's a single layer of tax, but it's also a more complex area of tax than corporate tax, or at least one that people it takes longer for people to understand the implications of each decision that you might make in the early years.
And then one just thing on terminology with LLCs, it's profit interest, right?
Well, for options, you can have options in an LLC, but yeah, a term that I failed to mention, Dave, thanks for the reminder. In LLCs, a profits interest is a feature that tax lawyers have come up with to mimic the economics of a stock option. And that's a good example of a way more complex instrument than an option. And so, and something you should think about, I think, as you decide, is a corporation, is an LLC, the LLC is going to be issuing profits interest with people, which it just takes longer for people to wrap their head around the actual words on the page. The economics are virtually the same, as virtually identical to the stock option.
Okay. Do we have, I know that we've got a conflict of time. Do we have time for one more question, or how are we doing? Yeah?
I just wanted you to say that word again for the option in an LLC. Did you say profit interest?
Yeah, profits interest.
Okay,
yes.
thank you.
Okay. Well, Neil, Dave, and Matt, thank you so much for being here this morning. I have a question. As we do these sessions, do you prefer, raise your hand if you prefer early morning? Okay, raise your hand if you prefer lunch and learn. And raise your hand if you prefer like 4:30 thereafter. Awesome. Okay, thank you. Everybody that's here is here all morning. Thank you so much. Yes, I'll send out the slides. Yes. Oh, good. Thank you for coming over here.